Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. Um, this time we're gonna walk through Washington D.C. again, but it's the last video in D.C. I swear. We're gonna do chapters of 4 in every city, and LA is coming up next. I already have some videos recorded. I'm still thinking about the topics to talk about LA, but in this video we're gonna talk about democracies and because I think the longevity and the risks that democracies are facing, it's a very important topic for our current times. We are already seeing many changes and debates and movements regarding democracy. So I think it's a relevant topic to talk about, especially in a city like Washington, D.C., which represents democracy in the United States. So I hope you enjoy it, and please let me know what you think in the comments. Peace. When we look at the political systems we live under today, it's easy to assume they are permanent. Democracies feel stable, institutions feel established, and constitutions feel enduring. But if we zoom out and look at history, a very different picture appears. Human political systems are temporary, every single one of them. And that's not necessarily a crisis, it's simply how human societies evolve. If we compare human history to the age of the universe, the entire story of civilization occupies only the smallest fraction of time. Even within the short history, systems of power have constantly changed. Civilizations rise, develop institutions, and build structures that feel eternal. Yet, eventually those structures weaken, adapt, or disappear. Ancient Egypt, for example, lasted for thousands of years and seemed immovable in its time. The Roman Empire dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries. In medieval Europe, feudal hierarchies organized society around land, loyalty, and inherited authority. Later, absolute monarchies ruled large parts of the world under the idea that kings governed by divine right. In their own eras, each of these systems appeared natural and unquestionable. People were born into them, lived their lives within them, and often struggled to imagine a different way of organizing society. And even so, all of them eventually changed. The reason for that is very simple. Political systems are not natural laws. They are human constructions. They emerge to solve the problems of a particular time. Feudalism organized societies built around land and agriculture. Monarchy centralized authority in times of conflict and expansion. And democracy, in many ways, emerged as a response to tyranny and concentrated power, offering a system where legitimacy comes from the participation of citizens rather than inheritance or force. But as societies evolve, the conditions that gave birth to those systems also evolve. Technology changes, economies transform, and populations grow more complex and interconnected. What once felt like the perfect solution can begin to show limitations. Philosophers have long suggested that political systems evolve through tension and contradiction. The famous German philosopher Hegel described history as a dialectic process. An existing system emerges, it encounters opposition or internal contradictions, and eventually a new synthesis takes its place. Whether or not one accepts that exact framework, history clearly shows that no political system remains unchanged forever. Empires, republics, monarchies, and earlier forms of democracy have all gone through cycles of emergency, stability, and transformation. In fact, historians studying empires have noticed a striking pattern. Many empires that once dominated vast territories lasted only a few generations before declining. Political systems can appear incredibly strong in the present, yet prove surprisingly fragile over long stretches of time. Democracies today are not immune to this pattern. They are part of the same historical process. And that doesn't mean democracy is doomed, but it does mean democracy is not inevitable. Like every system before it, democracies exist within history. It was built by human beings to solve specific problems under specific conditions. And like every system before, it will eventually face pressures that test whether it can adapt. Understanding that reality is not pessimistic. In fact, it can be liberating. It reminds us that political systems are not sacred structures frozen in time. They are evolving tools that societies create, modify, and sometimes replace as circumstances change. But why did societies start building democratic systems in the first place? The short answer is that democracy emerged as a way to solve some of the most dangerous problems political systems face. Throughout history, concentrated power has often led to instability. When authority rests in the hands of a single ruler or a small elite, the system becomes vulnerable to abuse, succession crisis, rebellion, or collapse. Political thinkers began searching for ways to reduce those risks, and democracy was one of the answers. The word itself comes from ancient Greece. The term demokratia combines demos, meaning the people, and kratos, meaning power or rule. In the city-state of Athens, beginning in the 5th century before Christ, citizens participated directly in political decision-making, voting on laws and policies in public assemblies. Of course, that early form of democracy looked very different from modern systems. Participation was limited to a small groups of citizens, excluding women, slaves, and foreigners. But the idea introduced something revolutionary: the notion that political authority could come from the collective body of citizens rather than from kings, emperors, or divine mandate. And over time, that idea evolved. Modern democracies are mostly representative rather than direct. Instead of citizens voting on every decision, people elect representatives who make laws and govern on their behalf. Elections become the mechanism through which authority is periodically renewed or withdrawn. At its core, democracy rests on several principles: political equality, majority rule, individual rights, and the idea that governments must ultimately answer to the people they govern. But democracy also serves a practical purpose beyond ideals. In many ways, the structure of the modern state can be understood as a system designed to manage risks. For example, governments often distribute power across different levels: national, regional, and local, to reduce the chances of regional rebellion. Elections allow citizens to express dissatisfaction through ballots rather than through violence. Courts exist to resolve disputes under the rule of law. Armies defend against external threats, while political forces maintain internal order. Public institutions are designed to anticipate and manage problems before they spiral into larger crises. Seen from this perspective, the modern state becomes something like a vast risk management framework, attempting to maintain stability in a complex society. Democracy fits that framework by dispersing authority. Instead of concentrating power in one place, it distributes power across institutions and procedures that can check and balance one another. So if democracy was designed to reduce risks that destabilize societies, why are democracies fragile? The answer is not that democracy is inherently weak. In many ways, it is one of the most resilient systems of governance ever created. But it depends on a set of conditions that are difficult to maintain over long periods of time. Political systems rarely collapse because of a single event. Throughout history, governments have fallen when multiple pressures accumulated at once. Rebellions by regional leaders, popular uprisings, invasions, economic shocks, pandemics, large migrations, and environmental crises. When enough stress builds up, even strong institutions can begin to weaken. And democracies faces their own particular vulnerabilities. First, democracy depends heavily on trust. Citizens must trust that elections are fair, that institutions follow the rules, and that those in power will respect the limits placed on them. Without that basic trust, democracy procedures begin to lose legitimacy. Democracy also requires something that is psychologically difficult: the ability to lose gracefully. Elections produce winners and losers. For the systems to function, those who lose must still accept the outcome and continue to believe that the process itself is legitimate. A democratic system cannot survive very long if a majority of systems or a majority of its leaders begin to believe that some other form of government would work better. And another fragile element is the information environment. Democracies rely on citizens making collective decisions based on shared facts and open debates. When the flow of information becomes fragmented, manipulated, or unreliable, it becomes harder for societies to agree on reality itself. And that's something that we are gradually seeing in our current world. There's also a deeper tension inside democratic systems, the relationship between political equality and economic power. In theory, democracy is built on the idea that every citizen has an equal voice. Each person receives one vote, and political authority ultimately comes from the collective will of the people. But modern societies are also built around markets, wealth, and financial power. Money can influence political campaigns, media platforms, lobbying efforts, and access to decision makers. In practice, economic power can translate into political influence. And this creates a structural tension. Democracy promises equality in the political sphere, while economic systems often produce large inequality in resources and influence. And the result is not necessarily corruption or conspiracy. It is simply the reality that power can operate through multiple channels: votes, institutions, wealth, and networks of influence. Democracies must constantly manage the tension between economic inequality and political equality. Another paradox lies in the openness of democracy systems themselves. Democracy protects freedom of speech, association, and political organization. Those freedoms are essential to the system, but they also allow movements that oppose democratic norms to operate within it. In that sense, democracy gives space even to those who may wish to weaken it. Political competition can also gradually erode democratic norms. When rival political groups begin to see each other not simply as opponents, but as existential threats, the incentive to respect shared rules begins to weaken. Leaders may begin to challenge institutions, reinterpret laws, or push the boundaries of accepted behavior in order to defeat their rivals. And when those pressures accumulate, when trust declines, when information becomes contested, when economic power concentrates, and when political polarization intensifies, the system can begin to strain. None of this means that democracies inevitably collapse. Many have proven remarkably resilient. But it does reveal something fundamental. Democracies do not survive because it is enforced by force alone. It survives because citizens, leaders, and institutions continue to believe in the rules that hold it together. Occasionally, the tensions inside a democratic system become visible. In recent years, two events illustrated how moments of institutional stress can take symbolic form. The events of January 6th in the United States and January 8th in Brazil. In both cases, that were separated by exactly a year, large groups of citizens gathered around one of the central institutions of government, the building where legislative powers is exercised. The US Capitol in D.C. and the National Congress in Brasilia became focal points for protests after disputed or contested election outcomes. These events were not simply protests in public squares. They were directed towards symbols of democratic authority. Legislative buildings carry enormous symbolic weight, and they represent the place where the will of the people is translated into law. So when crowds gather together around them in moments of crisis, the conflict is not only political, it becomes visual and institutional. And what these episodes reveal is a deeper tension inside democratic systems. Democracies rely on procedures, elections, legal certifications of results, and institutional transitions of power. These processes are slow and rule-based. They are designed to transform disagreement into structured outcomes. But politics is also emotional. Citizens care deeply about the future of their societies, and political identity can become intertwined with personal identity. When large numbers of people believe that political outcomes are illegitimate, those emotions can collide with the procedural nature of democratic governance. In those moments, institutions become the stage on which broader societal conflicts play out. Another dimension of this tension involves political leadership. Democracies contain a wide range of voices, supporters of the system, critics, and those who question how it operates. Elected leaders themselves may challenge the legitimacy of electoral outcomes or the functioning of democratic institutions. This is not entirely new in political history. Democracies have always contained internal disagreements about their own rules. Debate, criticism, and dissent are part of the system. But the challenge arises when large segments of societies no longer agree on the legitimacy of the process itself. When trust in the procedure declines, the focus shifts away from policy disagreements and toward the institutions that manage the democratic process. At that point, the conflict is no longer just about who wins an election. It becomes a conflict about whether the system itself can still command confidence. Events like those seen in Washington and Brasilia illustrate how democratic tensions can move from abstract debate into physical space. And they remind us that democratic institutions are not only legal structures, they are also symbols. Symbols of collective agreement about how power should be organized and transferred. And when that agreement begins to fracture, those symbols can become targets. Democracies contain internal tensions by design. They allow disagreement, dissent, and criticism. But those same freedoms mean that stability of the system ultimately depends on something fragile, the continued belief that the rules are worth following. If political systems evolve over time, and if democracies themselves face internal tensions, then another question naturally follows. What might come after democracy as we know it today? History suggests that political systems rarely disappear overnight. More often, they transform gradually as societies adapt to new conditions. The Renaissance political thinker Niccolo Machiavelli once observed that political systems survive only if they are able to renew themselves. As he wrote, states that have a long life are those which can keep renewing themselves. If they do not renew themselves, they will not endure. In other words, longevity in politics does not come from permanence, it comes from adaptation. Democracies may not vanish, but they may evolve into different forms as societies confront new technological, economic, and social realities. One possibility already discussed by political scientists is a greater role for technocratic governance. As societies become more complex, some argue that decision-making may increasingly rely on technical expertise rather than purely electoral politics, with specialists playing a larger role in shaping policy. Technology itself may also transform democratic systems. Policies will constantly be more influenced by artificial intelligence, and digital platforms could make new forms of participation possible, including experiments with direct digital voting or continuous forms of civic input. At the same time, digital systems raise their own challenges. Algorithms already influence how information spreads, how opinions form, and how citizens engage with political issues. In the future, the relationship between technology, information, and political legitimacy may become even more important. Other political arrangements are also conceivable. Some societies may move toward stronger executive leadership in response to crisis. Others may experiment with hybrid systems that combine democratic elections with different institutional structures. In highly diverse societies, power may become more decentralized, leading to fragmented federations or regional autonomy arrangements designed to manage internal differences. None of these possibilities necessarily represent the end of democratic ideas. In many cases, they would still contain elements of representation, participation, and popular legitimacy. What may change is the form those ideas take. Future generations may look back at our current political system and see it very differently from how we see it today. They may wonder why societies became so polarized, or why public debate was so easily shaped by digital information and rapid cycles of outrage. Many things that feel normal to us today may appear strange or inefficient in retrospect. That is often how history works. Each generation inherits political systems that feel natural and permanent, only to discover later that they were simply one stage in a much longer evolution. Political systems change when legitimacy changes, when societies begin to question whether existing institutions still reflect their values, their realities, and their expectations. And finally, to close our Washington D.C. chapter, I want to say a couple things about the city. Because few places illustrate democracy better than Washington D.C. The city was designed to embody a particular vision of governance. The Capitol, the White House, and the Supreme Court stand as the three pillars of a system built on separated powers and institutional balance. The wide avenues, the open public spaces, and the monuments reflect a political philosophy that places the people at the center of national life. In that sense, Washington is more than just the capital of the United States. It is a symbol of one of the most influential democratic experiments in human history. But DC is also something else. It is a stage where the tensions of democracy become visible. Protests gather here, elections are certified here, political conflicts eventually converge here. The city embodies both the promise of democratic governance and the pressure that constantly tests it. That duality reminds us of something important. Democracies do not survive simply because they were written into constitutions or carved into monuments. They survive because people continue to believe in them. They survive because citizens accept the rules of the system even when outcomes are disappointing. And they survive because societies continue to renew their commitment to the principles that gave those systems legitimacy in the first place. In the end, democracy is not just a structure of government, it is a collective behavior. Washington may represent democracy in stone, through its buildings, institutions, and symbols, but democracy itself ultimately lives in the choices people make every day. Whether to participate, whether to respect the rules, and whether to believe that shared institutions are worth sustaining. And like every political system before it, the future of democracy will depend on how societies choose to shape it next.